Candace is going to be kicking us off with our opening words.
To see the world in a grain of sand and see heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. William Blake.
Yes, indeed, my friends. Yes, indeed. These are lofty goals, and I'm glad that we're here together to pursue them. It's such a blessing to be meeting with you today in this place that is no place, this space that is cultivated from the core of our beings, wherever we are, however we are, whatever time of day it happens to be. As you all know, the center of love is not a physical location. It's not in my basement. It's not at Scout House, but it's at the very intersection of time and space. It's at the only location we have ever known or visited, the only place that exists for you and me, the corner of here and now. Because, and this is a bit of a trip, then and there are only concepts in our minds. We can never go there because when we get there, it's here. And we can't really get to a future time either, because when we get to that future time, it will be now. And so it doesn't matter if you're in British Columbia or Ontario, Canada or Guatemala, sitting alone in your living room or in a crowded coffee shop, because the center of love is wherever you are. And we are always together with you. That's right. You're never alone, my dear friends. Never alone. All you have to do is look at the word alone, and you will see that alone is actually all one. Isn't that wonderful news? Whenever you feel alone or isolated or low, remember this, that your aloneness is actually all oneness, that you're connected to all by bonds both visible and invisible. Never alone, always connected to the entirety and always supported, especially by this beautiful community of kindred spirits. So today I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about our agreements, our community agreements, because it's something that we don't really bring up all that often, although I think it's always present underneath the surface. And so I wanted to just go through them very quickly. There's only 3 of them because we're simple like that. So the 3 agreements that make this community what it is are as follows. We're all part of one single human family. Everything in the universe is interconnected. And love is the connective tissue that holds the entire enchilada together. So speaking of connection, I was giving my son Cyrus soccer advice the other day. I was talking to him about creating patterns and breaking patterns. And I was saying, for example, say you've got the ball and you go left, and you get the ball again and you go left again. And you keep going left until the other team expects you to go left. And that's when you've established a pattern. Well, now that they expect you to go left, you go right, and you're going to get right to the net because they're not expecting you to do that. And as I was telling Cyrus this stuff, he stopped me and he said, "But Dad, how do you know? You've never played soccer in your life." And I was like, "Good point, Cyrus. That's a very good point. How do I know that?" Well, because it's the exact same in boxing, which is a sport that I'm very familiar with. And in boxing, the greatest fighters, that's what they do. They do something like they'll stick a jab lightly, right, to get a reaction of their opponent. And they'll keep doing this. And eventually, once that pattern is established, they'll fake it and then they'll do something else, right? Floyd Mayweather is a great example of this. And so I told him, I said, it's the same in boxing. It's also the same in chess. If you play the same person in chess over and over again, you can do the exact same thing. You open with the London and you keep opening with the London, and then eventually you break the pattern and you open with a different opening, and all of a sudden your opponent, they don't really know what to do. And so why am I sharing this with you after talking about the agreements? Well, because that's how my mind has always worked instinctively. My mind is always seeking parallels, intersections, underlying similarities. In other words, my mind is always trying to connect the dots, or so I used to think. But more on that later, because as it turns out, the dots don't actually need to be connected. So when I started seeking answers to the big questions some 10 years ago, my approach was no different. The first three books that I discovered and consulted on my journey, Marcus Aurelius, the Meditations, the Tao Te Ching, and the Bhagavad Gita, on the surface, these books had nothing in common. One of them is the private journal of a Roman emperor. The other one is a compilation of cryptic utterances from a mythical Chinese sage. And the last one is an Indian scripture that represents a conversation between a prince and God. So when you look at them, they come from different cultures, different eras, and they're very, very different. These are the fellas that I was just talking about, right? We've got Lao Tzu, Marcus Aurelius, and the Bhagavad Gita. And so on the surface, they had nothing in common. But as I read these three books and reread them over and over again, and as I broadened my field of inquiry, a dazzling picture started to come into focus. So despite coming from very different sources, I started to find among these works of spirituality, philosophy, and mythology certain recurring principles and practices that, when tested in the laboratory of life, when embodied and deployed in real time, transformed my entire perspective and character in sudden, profound, and empowering ways. Now, I don't think I'm telling you that I've got it all figured out. The picture is still hazy and coming into focus, and it's incomplete. There's still a lot more for me to discover and learn on this journey. But there's no denying the overarching pattern that lies within all of these traditions, nor the power with which this pattern is imbued. There's an old saying, the truth is one, but the wise call it by many names. That's the discovery that I made at the onset of my journey. Blasphemy. Heretic. I imagine that these are the words that most traditional, orthodox, mainstream religious people would use to describe me after making such a statement, that the truth is one and the wise call it by many names. But even if I were accused of being a heretic or a blasphemer, I would stand by these words because I always come with receipts, my friends. I don't just talk, I have evidence. Is it possible then that all the great religions and faith traditions of the world and history, with their prophets and their sages and their teachers, basically agree on all the major points? Furthermore, if this is true, how could the followers and adherents of all these different traditions be so oblivious to something that seems so obvious to a layman such as myself? Because I didn't grow up with any religion, and I'm not an academic. This is all based on spare time readings. So if it's obvious to me, how is it that it was missed by all these other people who are dedicated to these paths? Well, I have an explanation, but it's not mine. It actually comes from the Sufi poet and mystic Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi. And he has a beautiful, beautiful parable about this. It's called The Elephant in the Room, or at least that's what I like to call it. And it goes a little something like this. Some Hindus have an elephant to show. No one here has ever seen an elephant. The Hindus bring in it at night to a dark room. One by one, the villagers go in the dark and come out, telling us how they experienced the animal. One person happens to touch the elephant's trunk, and he describes the animal as a water pipe kind of creature. Another person has touched the ear, and she describes the animal as a very strong, always moving, back and forth fan animal, right? Another touches the leg. I find it still like the column of a temple. Another touches the curved back, a leathery throne. Another, the cleverest, feels the tusk, and he describes it as a rounded sword made of porcelain. Ah, he's proud of his description. Each person touches one place and understands the whole in that way. Each person touches one place and understands the whole in that way. The palm and the fingers feeling in the dark are how the senses explore the reality of the elephant. If each person held a candle there, and if they all went in together, they could see it. Not sure if that one makes sense, but through the lens of this metaphor, one of my life purposes, what what I aim to do in my work is to turn the lights on in the room, fling the doors wide open, and invite all comers to enter and behold the mighty elephant in all its glory. You see, I'm trying to uncover and make accessible all of these common threads that we find in all the different religions and philosophical schools of history, documenting the recurring truths and perennial principles that I have discovered. And by the way, I'm not the first to discover these, obviously, and I won't be the last. All I'm trying to do is raise a bit of visibility here. So, for example, there's the three I's, which are these recurring themes in all the traditions. Okay, the three I's: impermanence, which is to say that change is the only constant, interconnectedness, and interdependence. Now, impermanence is a little bit depressing. I do have a talk written about it. It's called Everything Breaks, but I don't feel like delivering that today. I'd rather focus on the last two principles, the last two I's, which is, of course, interconnectedness and interdependence, because they relate directly to our community agreements. And because, well, like I said, that's the way my mind works. It's all about connections. And so the last two I's, the interconnection and interdependence, I simply like to say that all is one. It's a lot simpler and, well, a bit less of a mouthful. So let's explore these principles. Let's explore this idea that everything is one. And so we will go to my first teacher, my first guide in this journey of spiritual exploration, Marcus Aurelius, Stoic philosopher, and also happened to be the last of the good Roman emperors, a brilliant man in many ways. He wrote in his journal, everything is interwoven, and the web is holy. None of its parts are unconnected. They are composed harmoniously, and together they compose the universe. One universe made up of all things, one divinity present in them all. Yeah, it sure is a holy web. And guess what, my friends? It's not just made up of spirituality and philosophy. Oh no, nothing, nothing is unconnected, as Marcus Aurelius said. Even things that are commonly thought to be contradictory or in conflict with each other turn out to be harmonious parts of the whole. You see, my exploration wasn't limited to spirituality and philosophy. As a seeker, I follow the threads wherever they lead me. And in time, my spiritual exploration led me somewhere rather unexpected: science. Now, for most people, science and spirituality or science and religion are contradictory forces, but I have found that actually they confirm and clarify each other. And science doesn't contradict spirituality, it actually reaffirms it. A scientific perspective and understanding of reality also helped me deepen my sense of awe and reverence for all that is, for the one that is all, and of which we are all a part. Here's the story that science tells us about creation. It's actually deeply in accordance with a lot of the spiritual and mystical traditions of the world. Let's start with the Big Bang first. Now, some people will tell you that the Big Bang that it describes how everything came from nothing, that all the universe, all the matter and the energy suddenly exploded out of nothingness. But this is actually untrue. Scientists are very clear that right before the Big Bang happened, if it happened, all the matter and the energy in the universe was already there. It already existed. But because nobody has any idea how that can be, scientists tend to just gloss over that part and they get to the fun stuff, which is the Big Bang itself. Now, you might be wondering what that picture is up on the screen. It's actually a very close up picture of the head of a pin because all the matter and the energy in the universe at the very start or at the very end, depending on how you look at it, was compressed into a space no bigger than the head of a needle, which is what we're looking at here. So imagine all the galaxies, all the planets, all the stars, all the energy that is present in the universe today was compressed into this tiny, 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 tiny point in space. That's the prologue. And then, of course, God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And a big boom. A fiery explosion of inconceivable energy surged forth, spilled forth really like liquid. And what is the state of this early universe, you ask? It was an incredibly hot, incredibly dense, undifferentiated soup. There was no particles, there was no atoms, there was no molecules. It was just an unbroken sea of energy. One without other. No division. Sounds pretty mystical so far. Let's continue along, because as this singular ocean of energy started to cool down, it started to fragment into pieces. And that's how we started to get particles and atoms, the basic building blocks of everything there is. And so in this way, the one became many. But this doesn't last long, because as soon as it becomes many, it immediately begins the work of coming together again. Atoms come together to form molecules. Molecules come together to form the very first stars. And those stars, when they run out of fuel, well, they have little mini Big Bangs themselves, and they in turn spread the molecules that are needed to form other stars. And this process goes on and on and on. And with each generation of stars that goes supernova, we have new, heavier elements, which is to say the very elements we need to create more novel and complex forms, like, say, a human being, perhaps. And so if we fast forward a few billion years, we zoom in on Earth, we find these single-celled organisms, unicellular, the very first life forms on the planet, once again, through the lens of science. And these tiny creatures, it didn't take them very long to realize that they do a lot better if they work together. And so from unicellular organisms, we start to get bigger and more complex life forms. And if we fast forward again a few more billion years, here we are. Now we're talking about cells. Each cell can be potentially its own independent life form. Your body is made up of 37.2 trillion cells. That's trillion with a T. Liz, there are more cells in your body than there are stars in the Milky Way. Each cell potentially an independent, standalone life form, but somehow, by some means, they don't have brains. It's not like they were thinking, hey, we should get together. Something happened, and they started to join up again. So you see, there's something at work here, my friends. There's something at work pulling it all back together again. And what is this power that pulls all the cells together, or that causes them to join together to form more and more complex life forms? Well, if we ask the scientists, because we are talking about science right now, they'll tell you that the material universe and everything in it is the result of four fundamental forces. You probably know them. There's gravity, there's electromagnetism, and there are the weak and the strong nuclear interaction. Don't worry if you don't know them or if you don't know what they are, because ultimately, I don't think it matters that much. For the intents and purposes of this talk, what I would like to suggest to you today is that behind these four fundamental forces lies one single power. That in fact, these four forces are just manifestations of one power, one force. And by now, you're probably able to guess where I'm going with this. But just in case it's not quite clear yet, I will quote the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. He says, "In love, one and one are one." Oh, now that's not mathematically sound, is it? One plus one is two, but in love, one plus one becomes one. Interesting. And in case it's not abundantly clear yet, I will go back to my good friend Rumi, the great poet, who has so much to offer. If you've never read his poems, I highly, highly recommend them. Now, Rumi tells us that love is the bridge between you and everything. You and everything. So forget about gravity, my friends. Forget about electromagnetism and the weak and strong nuclear interactions, because these are all scientific ways of talking about the same power, which is love. Love is the silk that threads this holy web that unites us to each other and the world and to the entire universe.
Yeah, I wish I'd remembered.
I said earlier that the dots don't need to be connected. They're already connected. And so what I would like to suggest to you today is that instead of trying to connect the dots, what we need to do is uncover the connections that already exist, cultivate them, nurture them, strengthen them, and then work our way outwards into the world to bring it all together in love and with love. Okay, so we've got some closing words from John Muir. And Candace, did you want to read that?
When one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world.
She finds it attached. They
They
find it
find it
attached.
attached.
Yes, indeed. I usually try to change quotes to make them gender neutral or at least gender equal, but I forgot with this one.
That's okay.
Yeah, my apologies.
We all find it attached.
There we
to the rest of the
go.
world.
Yeah, yeah, and I love that, Sherry, you brought up the connection to nature. People were talking about connecting to people, connecting to
Trees.
spirit, with trees. Yeah, all of it. Because everything is connected to everything, there's no limits to what we connect to and what we connect with. And I just think that as long as we remember the power that does the connecting and we try to cultivate that in ourselves, then we are changing the world by example in a meaningful way.